So for Unit 3, Lab 3, we have our wall plate, which we've laid out on our platform here. And when you lay out your wall plate, just make sure that you are to the dimensions indicated on the drawings. So the span of our major roof is 38 inches. You should be consistently 38 inches over the length of the building. You should also check it for square. So the way we check for square is to just measure across the diagonal and make sure that each diagonal is the same dimension. And so we're good on the main part of the roof. And then check your dimensions for each segment on the blind valley portion of your roof. So 32 inches, another 32, and your final 32, and coming out 8 inches beyond. It's okay if your plate here runs through. So we have our dimensions, our overall plan dimensions, as per our drawings. Once our wall plates are installed, we're ready to lay out for all of our rafters. The first layout marks I like to do are for the hip rafters, and I'll do those on the four corners of the main wall plate. So starting at one corner here, I'm going to take my speed square with the 45-degree angle, and I'm going to match that up right exactly at the very outside corner. And I'm just going to make a reference line there, and that's going to indicate the center line of one of my hip rafters. Now, because my hip rafters are 2x material, which are 3.5 inches thick, I'm going to offset that center line by half the thickness of a 2x. So 3/4 inch offset there and there. And I'll take my speed square and I'll mark a line through those marks, and that set of lines will be either face of my hip rafter. So my hip will go right there. I'll repeat that process on all four corners of my major roof. I now have all my four hip rafters laid out, and I'm ready to lay out for my king common rafters. The king commons will be centered on the span ends of our roof, as well as where the intersection of the hip and ridge meet. So likewise over here. Let's do the span end first. So whatever the span of my building is, in this case it's 38 inches, I'm going to divide that in two. I'm going to find dead center of my wall. So half of 38 is 19. 19 will be the center of my king common rafter. So again, I'll start from 19, and since my king common rafter is 1.5 inches thick, it's a 2x, I'm going to pull 3/4 either side of my center line to mark my location of my king rafter. And I'll mark that with a K. So now that I have the center of my king for the span end, I want to mirror that dimension on this wall. Because my hip is at a 45-degree angle, I'm going to make a big square with my adjacent king common rafter. So if I measure from this corner over, my line starts at 18 1/4, and my opposite line is 19 3/4. So I'm going to make that same layout mark on this wall. 18 1/4, 19 3/4. And mark it with a K. Likewise, I'll do it on this wall. And then I'll repeat the process on the other end of the roof. If you haven't already calculated mathematically the length of your ridge, you can actually easily figure out how long to make it with our layout marks that we have. The ridge should go from the outside of this king common rafter to the outside of this king common rafter. Based on the math that I calculated for this roof, my ridge should be 59.5 inches. I have a piece of wood cut here for my ridge, and if I line it up with the end of my mark there, I see that I am right where I want to be on the other side. So my ridge is the proper length, goes from the outside to the outside of my two king common rafters. We have our ridge mounted between our two king common rafters, which are screwed in at the layout locations on the ends of our roof, and again at the top here. Right now there isn't any lateral stabilization. We're going to put our two adjacent king common rafters in on both ends on either side. So we'll do that next. If you refer back to your plan drawings of your roof, we'll look at the line art or the line drawings that are associated with this roof. And the intersection of the hip, the king commons, and the ridge happens at this very location that is center line of the ridge, and 3/4 from the actual end of the ridge. So that intersection, that theoretical meeting point, is right here. We extended the end of the ridge by half of its thickness so that we could install this king common rafter in exactly the same manner as we do the opposite or the adjacent king common rafters. So this is our intersection meeting point, and then we cut back for half of the ridge thickness on all of our rafters, even including the hip rafter. When we screw these two rafters together, we want to create a nice, clean inside corner pocket right at the very end of our ridge. And then our hip will nest right in between those two. So I'm going to go ahead and screw this on, and then I'll position my hip rafter. All right, so we have our hip that's pre-cut, we have our layout mark, and we're going to nest this hip into the pocket of our two king common rafters. If I set my hip down on my mark, you'll notice I've got my forward line or my forward layout mark, which is should be at the height of my height above plate measurement, and that should match the height of my king common rafter height above plate marks as well.
Gotcha.
Up here at the top, the very point of our hip rafter will actually be a little bit lower than our ridge, and that is how we want it to install. The way that the roof is going to plane, if we imagine a sheet of plywood sitting on top of our rafters, that sheet will sit flat on the king common rafters as well as the jack rafters, and as it comes across, that the bottom face of that sheeting is just going to barely skim over the outside corner of the hip. So we want the outside corner of the hip to plane with the top edge of both faces of our common rafters. So this face and this face. So right there, these two planes should flush up, here and here. The very tip of your hip rafter will be buried a little bit, and that is normal. So on the top of my rafters, I've drawn the center lines representing the stick line figures that we know from our plan drawings. Here's our intersection point of this entire assembly. We have our ridge, we have our common rafters, and then we have our two hip rafters. And they all converge to that singular point on our ridge. And then, of course, our thickness is symmetrical about the center line of each of those rafters. And then we'll do the same process on this end. Depending on how your rafters land on your platform here, you may have to clip the tails of your rafters to so that they don't collide with the table surface. On this end of the roof, we're going to install jacks in an ascending fashion, meaning we're going to start from the very outside corner of the wall plate, and we're going to go on our on-center spacing of 8 inches from the outside up the hip rafter, so 8 inches over up to the hip, and then another 8 inches up to the hip. And then likewise we'll start on the opposite corner, over 8 inches up to the hip, over another 8 inches up to the hip. So the first thing we'll do is we'll lay out our wall plate as well as our hip for the location of our ascending jacks. I'll hook my tape on my wall plate here, find my 8-inch on center, and then pull back 3/4 for half the thickness of my lumber, and mark my wall plate, and I'll label it with a J. And then I'll step over another 8 inches and mark another. So another J over there. And now what I can do is I can use my king common rafter as a reference plane to locate the marks on my hip. So this jack, okay, so you can see the far face of my jack is 3 inches from the near face of my king rafter. So I'm going to take that line, I'm going to parallel up and make a mark on my hip rafter, like so.
Okay, got it.
And then I can do the same thing for my next jack. And you may find it helpful just to extend that line. And if we've done this correctly, those marks should be symmetrical on the other side as well. So 3 inches and 3 inches, 11 inches and 11 inches. On the opposite end of our roof, we're going to install jack rafters in a descending fashion, meaning we're going to start at the center of our king common rafter and go over 8 inches to the center of our next jack, and then another 8 to the center. And then likewise on the opposite side of our king, 8 inches over and another 8 inches over. For these, I can simply butt my tape to the face of my common rafter. So on the end, since I'm going center to center of my common rafters here, my common and my jack, I can simply butt my tape to the face of my king rafter, make a mark at 8 inches, and then come back 1.5 inches. And that will be the location of my first downhill or descending jack. I'll repeat that process on all 4 corners of this end of the roof. So here's our ascending jack hip side, and you can see I started from my corner. I worked up the rafter, so I had my first jack rafter at 8 inches on center, my next one at 16, and you can see I'm fairly close to my king common up here with those 2 center jack rafters. If I put a straight edge on the top of my rafters, okay, along the top edge of my jacks, my common, and my hips, I should be fairly flat all the way up. Generally about 1/8 inch of variance is okay for sheeting. It's tough to get more accurate than that. So plane up this side as well, nice and flat.